For the second lecture, April 8th, Friday, we're going to look at these examples of biomes. Just to review very briefly, we looked at these 9 different parts of the world, they're scattered around the world, but at least on land, there are 9 major types of vegetation. And those vegetation zones, or biomes, in other words, they have similar characteristics because they're shaped in similar ways by the environmental conditions, especially features of climate like temperature and rainfall, especially rainfall. And we recognize that each one of those, as well as some other factors, are influenced heavily by the distribution of solar energy. And I pointed out that rather than go through these 9 biomes, as you often do in some ecology class, and say, look, here's this biome, this type of vegetation, this type of characteristics. We're going to lump these together and do just 3 based on latitude. Latitude, as we saw earlier in the semester, and hopefully you're very familiar with, latitude is correlated with rainfall and, of course, temperature as well. If you're close to the equator, it rains a lot. If you're close to the equator, obviously it's hot, warm temperature. The farther you move away from the equator, the less rainfall there is. And of course, there's these Hadley cells, the 30-degree bands, where you move away from the equator, the amount of rainfall declines. But there's this really dry part where you tend to find deserts. And then it starts to rain more. The amount of rainfall increases. And then you move farther north and you get to another band of really dry weather based on the high and low pressure zones and whether the clouds are moving up, and when they reach an elevation to start raining, or whether the clouds are being held down by high pressure and it doesn't rain very much. So with rainfall, there's a little more variation as you move north. With temperature, there's a strong gradient of it getting colder and colder the farther you move away from the equator, not just to the north, but to the south as well. Well, anyway, let's look at these 3 different climate zones, and within each one of those climate zones, you're going to find different number of biomes. For example, in this tropical climate zone, it rains a lot and it's warm, close to the equator. So there's not much of a winter. In fact, in some of these tropical places, the saying is that winter is at night because it's colder at night than it is during the daytime in the winter. That the change in temperature is the most drastic from daytime to nighttime compared to summer and winter. In the winter, it's still really warm. So what do you find there? You've got a lot of rainfall, you've got a lot of solar energy. You find plants that are very good at existing in those kind of conditions. And so some places you find tropical rainforests. You go a little farther to the north where there's less rainfall. It's still really warm. And then you find not tropical rainforests, but tropical seasonal forests. And then you get to where it's drier, a little farther from the equator, maybe up to 20-some degrees north and 20-some degrees south, and you find deserts. It's still really hot. I mean, that's what you think of when you think of a desert. It's really hot. But it's also really dry, and it gets cold at night compared to what you find. So let's look at these 3 different biomes. Tropical rainforests. You look at the distribution of those in the green in this map. Close to the equator, a lot of rainfall, a lot of sunlight. And if you look at the second one, the tropical seasonal forest savanna, they're not right on the equator for the most part. They're a little farther north and a little farther south from the equator. So the temperature's not quite as high. The amount of rainfall not quite as high. And then the third one there, the subtropical desert, you see where that is? It's not quite 23.5 degrees north. There's these big bands in the North America. We've got deserts. In Africa, there's a huge desert. Australia, desert. There's some desert in the southern hemisphere as well. So these are, for the most part, they're within the tropics. You see in North America, this big, the Mojave Desert, Death Valley, those places, they're farther north than 23.5 degrees. So technically, they're not in the tropics, but they're still at relatively low latitudes. So warm places, a little cooler as you move north and south of the equator. And then in terms of rainfall, if you have a lot of rainfall, that's associated with tropical rainforests. Less rainfall is associated with tropical seasonal forests or even savannas. And then where it's really dry with very little rainfall, so we saw the explanation for that, is subtropical desert. Well, let's move a little farther away from the equator to these temperate latitudes. So these climates, not too hot, not too cold, not too extreme, not too rainy, but fairly, well, there's a gradient of rainfall, a gradient of temperatures. But these are kind of intermediate levels of rainfall and intermediate levels of temperature. They're not the coldest places, they're not the hottest places. They're not the driest places, they're not the wettest places. Some places are pretty dry, some places are pretty wet. Some places are a little warmer than others. So you don't have this year-round constant season like you have in the tropics. There's more of a season. And what you find here, these lower, or these mid-latitudes anyway, is a lot of deciduous trees. Things like maple and oak. And other parts of the world, there's other similar types of deciduous trees. Now, as you get into places where there's less rainfall, then you're not going to find these big deciduous trees, and you find some other types of vegetation, dominant types of vegetation that are associated with lower amounts of rainfall. It's drier, and it's harder for bigger trees to exist there. So the biomes that you find there, if it's pretty wet, you can have temperate rainforests. It's not tropical rainforest, but temporal rainforest. What we have around here is a lot of temperate seasonal forests where there's a big influence of the seasons. And then as you get moved to places that are a little drier, you have woodland, shrubland, and then even more dry, you've got temperate grasslands, deserts. Not enough rainfall to support the big trees, but still, it's not such an extreme environment. So let's look at those 4 different biomes. This is 4. It's almost half of the 9 biomes that we're looking at. Temperate rainforests. Now, in some parts of the world, Australia and New Zealand and South America, and what we're familiar with is the west coast of the U.S., where the weather comes off of the ocean. It rains a lot there. It's very rainy, very green. So you've got rainforests. Sometimes some places it rains 300 or 400 inches a year. Very, very wet, lush green. It's not near the tropics. There's still some seasonality to this. So you've got temperate rainforests. A little less rainfall, weather patterns from a different direction. For instance, in North America, you've got temperate seasonal forests. So if you look at the eastern United States, where you've got all these deciduous trees, including Rhode Island and most of the places that you guys are, now there's the weather comes off over the land rather than the water, so it's different. The influence of climate, rainfall, temperature, colder, not as much rainfall. Now you've got seasonal, heavily influenced by the seasons, and in Europe and Asia as well, you see those primarily in the northern hemisphere. If you look at the woodland, shrubland type of biomes. You see that in the southwestern United States, California especially, other parts of Europe and the Mideast, and then South America, parts of Australia and Africa as well, where there's not as much rainfall, not as big a distribution of those. That's where you find woodland, shrubland biomes. Now, even drier, farther away from the coasts for the most part, you find temperate grasslands or even deserts where there's not so much rainfall. Not enough rainfall certainly to support forests, whether those are coniferous forests like you find in the temperate rainforest or deciduous trees that you find in the temperate seasonal forests, or even shrubs. So these are all biomes that are associated with these temperate conditions. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. Some places are pretty dry, some places are pretty wet. You could have the scale from a rainforest to a desert. Now that's pretty extreme in terms of wet and dry, but still not to the same degree that you find tropical rainforests or really subtropical deserts or the tundra as well. And if you move up north, farther north or farther south, there's not as much land to the south, but you get into this high latitude climate zone where it's cold. Look how cold it is, and it doesn't rain that much up here. So now you've got these boreal forests, and if you go a little farther north, a little more extreme conditions, then you have this biome of the tundra. So let's look at those. Where you find this, there's big swaths of land that are covered by these boreal forests, these northern forests in Canada and part of the US and in Europe and Asia. Big giant swaths of land where you find these boreal forests. To the north, cold. In the southern hemisphere, you see there's hardly any because there's not that much land in those places. And then, similar to that, you move farther north, more extreme environments. It's cold, 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 but not very much rainfall. You get into these biomes that are tundra, low grass, sometimes frozen for a long part of the year, high latitude biome, tundra, one of the most extreme in terms of community diversity, not very diverse. There's not that many species that you find there compared to some of these other places. So that takes us from this extreme of a lot of rainfall and a lot of sunlight at the equator to cold temperatures and not very much rainfall all the way at these very high latitudes. And that's the gradient you see in terms of temperature and rainfall. And it illustrates the different types of climate zones that are influenced heavily by the latitude that you're at. But you see at one latitude, you've got a number of different biomes, depending on the rainfall and depending on the temperature, depending on a number of environmental characteristics. But that's what you see for all this land in terms of these major community types, these 9 biomes, 3 different biome groups that are classified based on their latitude for the most part.